Adoption is changing, and one of the new ways to bring children into your family is a process called embryo adoption. What is it? Where did it come from? And what might this practice mean for the future of adoption and family building? To help shed some light on this, I talked to cultural anthropologist Risa Cromer, who has been studying embryo adoption and the politics surrounding it for many years. Find out more about what embryo adoption is and where it might be headed, this time on Adoption Uncovered. Tell me who you are and what you study.
Sure. My name is Risa Cromer. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a cultural anthropologist. And I focus on reproductive politics broadly, but I have a very particular interest in where reproductive politics show up in the intersecting fields of medicine, science, and technology.
Great. Well, I appreciate you talking to me today, and I'm excited to learn more about embryo adoption and how that figures into the whole reproductive landscape and what you've learned about it. I would love to start off with, can you tell me a little bit about what is embryo adoption?
A simple definition would be embryo adoption is a family-making process. It was developed by white evangelicals in the late 20th century, so 1997, that facilitates the donation of frozen embryos that are unused after in vitro fertilization. This practice, in addition to making family, that promotes a political agenda that's focused on recognizing embryos as rights-bearing persons. Embryo adoption is not to be confused with embryo donation, but these two practices share more than just some common words. They also share some common features. Embryo donation is the older and more recognized term for the process of essentially transferring embryos between donors, people who have embryos that they created through in vitro fertilization procedures, froze or cryopreserve them for potential future procreative use, and have decided to end their family-making process for one reason or another, and are seeking opportunities to donate those embryos to other individuals or couples for a chance for them to use them for procreative purposes. Embryo donation practices are often facilitated by clinics. There are over 200 in the United States alone that facilitate embryo donation between clinic patients. There are far fewer embryo adoption practices in the United States. About 8 programs currently promote embryo adoption. A key difference being that most of the embryo adoption programs are not based in fertility clinics. They're based in adoption agencies, churches, online marketplaces or matching services, with the exception of one that is based in a fertility clinic. So while it's not a legal adoption, a lot of the discourse, rhetoric, and the practice is modeled on domestic adoption practices. Another key feature here, that's anyone who's participated in domestic and international adoption in the United States would recognize the home study. It's a common, costly feature for folks who intend to adopt a child, have to go through to be vetted to ensure that they are, by one measure or another, competent and capable to do so. Participants in embryo adoption who wish to receive embryos also oftentimes are required by many of the programs in the United States to undergo a home study process and to pay the cost for that. So that's a key difference from embryo donation as well.
Yeah, you just said a lot of things there that sound like they're going to cause some problems in the future. Like just the idea that it's some sort of transaction, but we're not actually sure what it is. Like, I'd like to dig into that a little more. Is it a property transfer? Is it an adoption, or it's like a mix of both?
It is a property transfer. So in pragmatics, if you were to go to a court of law, the court of law would recognize it as a property transfer, meaning I'm not aware of any embryo adoption case having gone into court, but if we look at divorcing couples who have embryos remaining after family making practices like IVF and cryopreservation, who no longer wish to continue their relationship, their legal relationship, have to make decisions around what to do with their remaining embryos. This is far more common. When we look at those court cases, the earliest of which started in the late in 1980s. Questions that were posed to judges at that time and even to today were, what is an embryo in the court of law? What tradition of law might we apply to this question to decide which of the parties, if they cannot agree, ought to have more authority? And what rubric and criteria? The reason that divorcing couples would bring such a question to the court, and the court might would and did and continues to have sometimes very conflicting answers to these questions, is because we in the United States have a lack of consistent state and existing federal law that regulates the status of human embryos. The one sort of prevailing and persisting status of human embryos is as human tissue, which is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates all human tissue. And so embryos have been incorporated under that designation, and therefore are cryopreservation and biobanking and fertility clinics that are regulated by this federal agency has to adhere to the requirements for human tissue, which includes human embryos. That is the one sort of prevailing classificatory designation for human embryos. But because we have an absence of existing federal and sort of coherent state regulation, the question has been brought to the courts. And there you have judges in varying levels, state, federal, and at varying ranks within state courts, having to answer these questions. Are embryos personal property like a home or a boat, or are they like children, around which we had to have custody questions? Who would be the more prepared or deserving parent? Or are they some other legal category that doesn't exist? Are they a hybrid of both of these categories? And regardless of the answer to that question, how might we resolve this challenge, which is these two parties can't agree about what to do? And sometimes they would bring conflicting interests, which is one might intend to use the embryos, one might wish to discard them, one might wish to keep them frozen in perpetuity. We've seen quite a range when you look at the case law. We just have a smattering of a number of cases at this point, over a dozen, but not too many, to give us a clue about how the courts are interpreting and have been interpreting this for a few decades now. And as we've seen legal sea changes happen at the highest level of US law in the Supreme Court, it's a worthy question to ask when human embryos that have been created through IVF and have been stored in cryopreservation tanks for an indeterminate period of time, if and when they can accrue status other than human tissue, we are going to see massive legal changes and consequences for people who wish to make, use, and handle human embryos for procreative purposes or otherwise. It wasn't too many years down the road, if we go back to the late 60s and early 70s, when it was still an experimental technology. It was 1978 when the first human child was born via in vitro fertilization in the United Kingdom. Up until that point, it was experimental and unsuccessful in many animals and mammals. It changed much around human reproduction, not just in practice, but how we think about it. That human gestation used to solely occur within the human body for millennia, for the extent of human presence on planet. And so the ability to manipulate human reproduction in vitro and to hold it outside of place, the human body, and outside of time, what we know is sort of that gestational time, has created a number of opportunities as well as deep questions. And some might call those ethical, some might call those moral, some might call those political. And I think they're likely a mixture of all. And they're not going away. Not even if IVF shape shifts or it gets highly regulated or criminalized. We see this in places around the world that have a different approach to assisted reproductive technologies or cryopreservation. in which it's allowed or disallowed there, or regulated in ways in which they're not regulated here in the United States. People, as well as their gametes, by that, which I mean eggs and sperm, as well as their embryos, are crossing borders all the time. So there's a global exchange and network and circulation of reproductive resources that people want and are making move. And so the questions are not going to go away, even if and when the technologies and the infrastructure for those technologies change.
There may not be agreement on exactly what an embryo is among different groups in society, but once an embryo does get implanted into a person who is not their biological parent, the issues that surface are similar to those of all adoptees face. Will the child born from that embryo have access to medical history or ethnic history? Risa brings us up to date on what the current state of embryo adoption means for these children's knowledge of themselves. From the adoption perspective, some of the issues that I know adoptees have, for example, is getting that medical history, finding out about birth parents. When you have an embryo, is there that information, or is there any connection to the person who made that embryo for adoptees to find out one day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer that with respect to embryo donation as well, because this is true in this case. So in embryo donation, which happens oftentimes in clinics, that's primarily where it happens. So they're sort of clinic-based programs that help patients within that one clinic get access to embryos that are available by another patient for their procreative purposes. The common trend within in-clinic based embryo donation programs is a lot of anonymity when it comes to patients being able to know each other personally, to know much about the family history when it comes to personal likes or dislikes or family photographs, or even who they wish to receive their embryos, or the kinds of other sort of, we might call like personalized information, identifying information. But those programs typically are focused on the medical and clinic-based assessments of whether those embryos can help facilitate pregnancy. So embryo donation, according to the American Association of Reproductive Medicine, a definition they have of embryo donation is a medical treatment for infertility. And so the embryos that get included in embryo donation programs have been assessed clinically, oftentimes by embryologists, through reports that they use to both make and document the process of making IVF embryos and the assessments and gradings that they do along the way, including genetic testing of embryos if patients order that assessment. Together, all that information can give a story about the pregnancy potential of an embryo, and certain criteria that programs set to maximize the pregnancy potential for recipient patients means that many embryos are not included in their donation programs. But some of the info that they could get would be perhaps embryology report, perhaps a genetic, any genetic screening or diagnostics that have been done, and perhaps some race-based information. Those tend to be the common set of information that recipient patients in in-clinic embryo donation programs can have access to. Embryo adoption programs approach it much more in the model of open adoption practices. So in closed adoption practices, which we, if we harken back to the 1950s, sounds a bit like this, where people would not have, people meaning adoptees and children would not have access to knowing who the birth parents were in any identifying way. But in open adoption trends that were helped and aided by adult adoptees who wish to open closed records, said, we have rights to identities. We wish to know parts of our origin stories and the breadth of our families, and we are pushing for open records on this front. There's parallel and similar movement in third-party reproduction, largely through sperm donation, called the donor-conceived movement. So adult children conceived through sperm and egg donation, but predominantly sperm donation, have similarly pushed for open records that have been maintained as anonymous in third-party industry when it comes to buying and selling sperm and eggs. Embryo adoption sees these as problems. So informed by the open adoption movement, where openness is a more common feature of domestic adoption. It's often not a feature of international adoption for a variety of reasons. But in domestic adoption, there are trends to facilitate openness, even if it's not fully open. And you see that in embryo adoption, where participants who want to donate and receive embryos are encouraged to share identifying information. And this includes everything from personal family history. All applications for people who wish to donate their embryos in embryo adoption typically ask for detailed family history, including physical characteristics, as well as medical history, health history. And then they'll also ask other things like social and demographic questions, sort of like college education, which church you go to, or which faith tradition do you adhere to. And for recipients, asks for preferences around the kinds of families that they might wish to be matched with, whether that has to do with racial identity or geography, as well as contact. Like, would people like to have each other's emails so that they can send Christmas cards or meet up at Disneyland? So that, to which degree might they wish to know each other? But it's not uncommon in embryo adoption for both parties involved to create a profile of sorts in which they include not just medical information, but social and personal information that they wish to share, so that the matches that are made feel compelling.
Embryos, these ones that are being donated, are ones that have been rejected maybe from implantation originally or something. Are there any issues with how viable these are when they're offered to other couples or people?
Yeah, let me answer that. And in a way that uses some clinical language to help explain. So embryos that remain after in vitro fertilization that are frozen in cryopreservation have all been assessed by the embryologist who facilitated their creation, sometimes including genetic testing, but not always. So there's some embryology report and sometimes a genetic testing report. A very standard practice within IVF is to assess embryos, to rank them clinically with letters and numbers that say something about their morphology. And morphology, in addition to genetic testing, tells you something about its pregnancy potential, its chance to establish pregnancy. The practice now in IVF is oftentimes reliant on genetic testing to tell you whether an embryo is euploidy or aneuploidy, which means it has sort of conventional chromosomal composition or atypical unconventional chromosomal composition. If it's atypical, it would not be used clinically, it would be frozen. And if it has conventional, they would then use the morphology assessment, how embryos looked as they were developing over 5-6 days, to decide which should they transfer in to a uterus. Sometimes the embryos that remain are ranked great. There's just too many for a particular individual or couple to use. Sometimes they're more poorly ranked. The truth is they're using the best ranked embryos, both morphologically and genetically, to try to produce pregnancy, because IVF is regarded as a medical treatment for infertility. So they're trying to maximize pregnancy potential. So they're looking for the best embryos to try to do that. Although there's a variety of factors that contribute to pregnancy, this is one way they're trying to kind of pin it down. So sometimes people have, we might say, in clinical terms, perfectly fine embryos for creating pregnancy. And sometimes they have the more poorly ranked, less less likely to produce embryos. So not exactly rejected, but just unused because they were lower on the pecking order. And some people do have embryos that were frozen that had a genetic test of aneuploidy, saying that they had a chromosomal composition that was atypical, abnormal. And historically, clinically, those embryos would be discarded. They would not be put back into the uterus. But there have been some developments in understandings of genetic tests, genetic screenings that say the way that we biopsied embryos might have elicited more aneuploidy results than were factually true due to mosaicism, or the cells were mixed, but they corrected themselves later in development. So we might have discarded or unused some of the embryos that were actually morphologically and practically likely to establish pregnancy. So now they freeze all those embryos for the most part. And for some patients, they might use them if they run out, if they don't have any more eggs, don't have any more options, they might use the aneuploidy embryos. That's a case-by-case basis. All to say, there's a mixture of the kind of embryos that get donated through embryo donation programs. Embryo adoption programs tend to be far more lenient when it comes to the diverse range of embryos. There can be embryos frozen 20, 30 years ago, or 3 months ago. Those are all, the whole range is included. Embryos frozen using vitrification freezing procedures, which are the newest, freshest, best available, or slow freeze methods, which are far more common from the 20th century, from the 80s and 90s. They can come as single embryos. They can come in batches of 10, 20, and they can have a variety of compositions from like egg donor or sperm donor, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, genetic testing or screening and diagnostic results. So there's a diverse range of kinds of embryos, to put it that way.
Those who have embryos to donate after making them for their own IVF treatments are in new territory. The options they have are not well regulated, and statistics in this country don't show what most of them eventually decide to do with their embryos.
So the person who is offering that embryo for adoption, it sounds like they're pretty involved in the process, and a lot of times. And I know you said there's only a handful of places doing this, so I imagine it's different for each place, but
One
it
thing
sounds
that
like they can be.
Yes. So one thing that feels important to say is I'm speaking from a vantage, not just as a general curious researcher, but as someone who has spent a significant amount of time conducting ethnographic research within embryo adoption programs in the United States. So I've conducted over 6 years of ethnographic research, which means I was within a number of programs. There are 8 in the United States, and I spent time within many of them, learning from the professionals as well as the participants, the people who both give and receive embryos or opt not to. They apply, they open a file, and they decide for one reason or another to not pursue that practice or to pursue that opportunity. And I have a forthcoming book that captures a number of the stories and insights encountered in this practice and its connection to the broader movement in the United States for embryo personhood, which is a part of the anti-abortion movement and the broader Christian right. So this is the basis upon which I'm sharing some insights. So I want to offer that to your listeners as a caveat here for what I do and don't know in total. I'm not a professional facilitator of these programs, but I have been able to learn quite a bit of the last 15 years since I started giving this my sustained attention. As far as embryo donors go, there is a range of participation that seems available. The minimum in the programs I've looked at is to fill out a fairly extensive application process, including a family profile. There's no cost associated with donation except for paying for the storage fees during which you are waiting for a match. At the time of a match with a recipient, once those contracts are signed, the embryos can then be shipped from your clinic to the recipient's clinics. That's essentially when the transfer of responsibility, financial, and the transfer of ownership occurs. So the level of participation is in filling out for donors, is in filling out this detailed application, writing a letter. And I wish to emphasize this as not trivial, because some people I spoke to who learned for one reason or another that they were unable to use their embryos anymore for procreative purposes were not jazzed. They were deeply upset. This was not their plan, or they knew at the very beginning of IVF, when the first batch of embryos were made, that they would never be able to use the 24 embryos that were successfully created and frozen. So at some point along the way, people who had participated in IVF, who had created embryos in excess of their procreative need or intention, found themselves with a decision. And deciding on donation for procreative purposes to others is not always a straightforward process, and is not always satisfying, and it's not always what people want. Fertility patients in the United States typically have 4 options for their remaining embryos after IVF, and that is they can donate to others for procreative purposes, they can donate for scientific purposes, they can shift out of the clinic and store long-term, and the 4th option is they can discard. The vast minority of people are opting to donate, either for scientific research or for donation purposes, for procreation. The vast minority. I want to say, though, that we don't have great data on what many people are doing. We have no federal system for regulating in vitro fertilization practices. Ergo, we have no coherent system for governing, surveilling, or even having very good data of what's going on within the 500 fertility clinics within the United States. This is a contrast to other nations that have very active fertility markets through assisted reproduction technologies of various kinds, have much higher levels of federal involvement. So we don't know. The studies, we don't know. We can't really say how many embryos are currently in storage in the United States right now, how many of those embryos might be slated for potential donation, either for procreation or for science, or for long-term storage, or for discard. And the studies that we do have are typically either retrospective, they look at medical records to say, what did people do with their embryos? Or they're prospective, saying, what would people want to do? The limits of those studies is that what people want to, or say they want to do at the time of IVF, is typically not what they do later. And so we have this gap to understand what happened in there, and why did maybe ideas change? What was it about your life or your ideas about embryos, among family, parenthood, among other things, that changed your decisional opportunity? And maybe what is it about the options available to you that no longer feel satisfying or good?
IVF in this country has not served all communities equally, and neither has access to the embryos made from that process. Risa has learned of this disturbing inequality and wants to make sure going forward that these processes don't remain cloistered among those of the right race or income level.
In researching this book, I learned that the history of in vitro fertilization had a fork in the road moment in the United States. So soon after the first child was born in the United Kingdom, Louise Brown, in 1978, researchers and clinicians in the United States began borrowing some of the ideas from those practices to try to set up clinical practices here in the United States. And some of the early efforts, and there was a clinician in Southern California whose intention and effort was to make in vitro fertilization available to working class people, to make it available to folks of color and communities of color. And so there were some clinicians who worked with these populations in the United States who were eager to make these services available for the populations that needed it most. And there are a variety of reasons why communities of color experience infertility rates higher, but that is not the demographic that receives the bulk of fertility services in the United States, because at this sort of consequential fork in the road moment in the early to mid 1980s, investment went into IVF being a private versus subsidized public service. It fed quite appropriately into Reagan era rhetoric about responding to white women working, to say, more white women actually need to go back home and make families and to reinvest in family. So under the Reagan era model, IVF was actually very helpful to make upwardly mobile white women create and bear children, because the trends that were won by the second wave feminist movement were saying, it's okay to divorce, it's okay to work, it's okay to not be dependent, financially dependent on your husbands. And so when I think of responses today that would be really compatible with reproductive justice frameworks, is thinking very holistically about whether, when, and how people can make parenting decisions so that their children can exist safely. I think about communities of color. This idea comes from communities of color, Black feminists in particular. And we think about that point of intersection with fertility services. It's how might we help make available assisted reproductive technology so that communities of color can bear the children that they want. It also makes us think, how can we ensure that the children that they bear are safe? And so those are some of the problems that get obscured when by movements that really want to focus on the rights and status of human embryos and fetuses, when there seems to be a consistent disinterest in what happens with embryos and fetuses once born.
So it sounds like the path this has taken so far has been sort of the path of least resistance. It's kind of like a lot of adoption history ends up being a patchwork of, let's solve this little problem, and it ends up creating a lot of vacuums. So where do you think we should go from here?
I think that's a fair assessment. One of the intentions in my book is to draw attention to how some of these seemingly intractable systems reproduce themselves. How do they persist when there's such overwhelming countervailing evidence that things not only could be otherwise, but for many, they should be otherwise? And part of my hope in the book is to draw attention to sort of like how that engine stays in motion. And so one of the ways I do that in the book is I look at embryo adoption. I take very seriously the professionals and the practitioners and the participants in the programs, as well as supportive of the broader movement, which is more conservative and adherent to Christian right agendas, is to show how do those agendas persist? What gives them a coherent grammar? What makes them attractive to people who don't identify as Christian, who don't identify as white, who don't identify as conservative or pro-life? And I say that because participants in embryo adoption are not exclusively pro-white evangelical Christians. The majority of people I spoke to who participated and who were professionals in those programs did share those identities, but it's not everybody. And which is to say, what makes the practice seductive? And so part of this is looking at saviorism. I think a lot of that, this is something that crosscuts any political terrain, where the seduction to save something deemed at risk, vulnerable, and deserving of protection is something I see in a wide range of political domains and ethical problems and moral questioning. Saviorism, though, and particularly white saviorism, is essentially what propelled the history of U.S. adoption.
Risa has found that some of those in the embryo adoption community seem to want to use the practice to emphasize the personhood of embryos and advance other agendas that can distract from what really needs to be fixed. She would like to see more emphasis on making sure people of all races and backgrounds have equal access to practices that will help them make and raise healthy families.
Even though I have written quite a bit about the debates and the contestations and the practices around human embryos, my major takeaway is that our conversations need to be elsewhere and on other topics, because that is an effect of what this movement is wanting to do, is say, look here, not there, value this, not that, mobilize your resources, value this. And in doing so, it contributes to sort of systemic devaluation of Black and brown lives, pregnant, capable people, non-inclusive forms of care for people who can become pregnant, a variety of other things. So even though I spent quite a bit of time and quite a bit of ink drawing attention to this movement and what they care a lot about, my point in doing so is to try to to explain why we ought to redirect our attention elsewhere. Embryo adoption is not a practice that ought to or needs to be attractive only to white conservative evangelicals. I have received a number of calls from interested parties who've largely from the queer community, who are wanting to create and in many ways are already and have been for a while creating families with the affordances of assisted reproductive technologies, whether that's sharing sperm, sharing eggs, sharing wombs informally, as well as through formal systems for facilitating that. And embryo donation practices are more affordable option than egg donation, sperm donation, and surrogacy. So embryo donation is one of the lower cost forms of third-party reproduction currently in the United States because they've already been made. But for members of the queer community or people who are single, who would oftentimes be excluded from embryo adoption programs because they do not meet their criteria for inclusion as recipients, they're imagining embryo donation practices as very supportive of queer family making. And I could see this sort of lower cost form of family making being quite compatible for communities that are not able to afford the very costly private industry form of IVF. I would say I would not peddle embryo donation as a second best solution for families who can't afford it, much like I wouldn't peddle, children who are not as, let's say, they're harder to place, which is discourse from adoption agencies. Hard to place children would not wish to place them with families who are also harder to match, harder to get connected with as recipient parents by birth parents. I find that practice on both fronts troubling, to try to like match make in these ways. The hard to match families with the hard to match kids get each other, I don't think is a good option. I do like the idea of all people having a more diverse and accessible range of options that work best for them. And for some, embryo donation is going to work great. There's a freedom that people experience in not having to be included or excluded when trying to create a child with a partner. So let's say I couldn't create eggs and my male partner did have viable sperm, but if we wish to create a child together, both might feel relieved at saying, this child isn't genetically related to either of us, but we did get to have this pregnancy experience and go through birth. This could work really well for people for a variety of different reasons. And I assume that it will expand, actually, and there will be shape shifting in terms of what embryo donation and adoption means culturally and socially, if not legally, and that it is probably already happening in terms of how people are defining and making sense of these practices and the terms that correspond with them. I am not wedded to the Chronicle being a story already foretold, that embryo adoption needs to stay yoked to a right-wing Christian agenda. the discourse itself is very laden, and there would need to, in that movement, and there would likely need to be a lot of other work to unhinge it. But I suspect with new words and terms and with new ideas and practices, we'll likely see embryo donation as a practice become otherwise and become a support for a more diverse range of communities than it currently is. And I think that's great. And I'm interested in learning from all these different spheres and places how else we might wield our tools to create a world that's more inclusive, more kind, and more considerate. That is my hope. And embryo adoption has been a place for me to learn, a place for me to be humbled, and place hopefully for me to offer some insights that are useful well beyond this practice, this very niche practice, and has, I think, a lot of relevance in the state of the world today, given the Dobbs decision and the massive legal sea changes that we're seeing that have major social impacts. So my hope is that we can learn from some of these spaces where these agendas get traction and propel some ideas that I think can cause harm. And in learning that, we might learn better ways to do more good. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I know this is an adoption-focused blog, and one of the first things I shared is, or not blog, excuse me, podcast. And one of the first things I shared is this is not a legal form of adoption.
Yeah.
And one of, I think, the utilities of talking about a non-adoption practice on this podcast is that it's drawing upon traditions and words and rhetoric and meaning and social significance that are very salient to the practice of adoption, but also a bit indifferent to some of the more critical lessons learned from adult adoptees, from transracial, transnational adoptees, and some of the more, and the first mother birth, movements that are incredibly important to making adoption practices more rooted, grounded, humane, and worth our consideration in the United States. So my hope is that there's a translation effect here between the practice of embryo adoption, because so much of what's happening there is relevant to the world of adoption, even though we're not talking about legal transfer of parental rights for children.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is interesting, is that in some version, how you're talking about this community that has decided that embryos should become children, it does cross over into adoption. But when you're talking about the practical aspects, it's not yet. And I think, in the future, like, it sounds like there is a lot of different ways this could go, and that this should go, that are different than where it is. And it seems like there could be potential for good things to come of it, or there could be potential for great disparities. So it's almost like we're kind of at a point where we maybe we can push this into an area where more people could benefit from this, but we don't know.
Yeah, I agree.
Embryo adoption may have had its beginnings among a small group of people with similar beliefs about the world, but it has great potential. The practice is at a crossroads. Will it continue to be used by a small select group to promote a specific agenda, or will it become a broader, more regulated practice that can allow a variety of people to grow or start their families? Will we learn from other forms of adoption and allow children born from this practice to access the information about their medical and ethnic history? Now is the time to learn more and affect the trajectory of embryo adoption. If you'd like to learn more about embryo adoption and its ties to the white Christian community, Risa is coming out with a book that can be pre-ordered now, entitled Conceiving Christian America: Embryo Adoption and Reproductive Politics. Find a link to her book and more about her work on my website, Adoption Uncovered. And thank you.